Horrors of the First World War. They usually bring up the trenches, the artillery, and the machine guns. And although they were indeed more than horrifying, chemical weapons, on the other hand, deserve their own place on that list, because nothing else from that war attacked the human body in such a cruel and methodical way. We are going to go deep on that, and because this is not quite a light topic, we are giving you a chance here to reconsider watching this video if you are eating or are looking to avoid nightmares. Take this as a genuine warning before we go any further. So, if you are still here, let us start all the way from why there was a need for such a disturbing weapon in what was then considered a modern time. First of all, the idea itself was ancient, and long before modern armies marched across Europe, older civilizations had already learned that poisons and choking smoke could break stubborn defenses when normal weapons failed. During sieges, attackers sometimes poisoned wells or streams to force a garrison to surrender, or even blew irritating smoke to try to flush them out. These were occasional, improvised tricks rather than real battlefield doctrine, and they remained on the margins of warfare for centuries. In the years just before the Great War, a few chemists and military officers experimented with modern variations of toxic agents, but the tests did not impress anyone. The equipment and delivery methods were unreliable, and culturally, the whole idea smelled of dishonor. Unlike artillery or machine guns, poison carried a reputation of being sneaky and unfair, so military planners simply did not take chemical warfare seriously. However, they were about to change their minds when the war that was thought to end decisively in just a few weeks turned into the bloodiest stalemate in human history. I am talking here specifically about the Western Front. You all heard about it and the horrors of trench warfare, but believe me, you did not know just how bad it was going to get. You are now going to see why chemical weapons are not widely discussed by historians. So, the situation is this. Both sides dug in, with no one able to outmaneuver the other, or to break the trench defenses directly. This was mainly because of the new weapons like machine guns and quick-firing artillery, coupled with the first serious use of aircraft in warfare. The old tactics did not catch up with the technology, and armies found themselves simply locked in one against another with no solution in sight. Not long after the trenches fully locked in, disturbingly creative attempts to break the deadlock began to take place. And our topic today is one of them, and perhaps the worst one. Okay, now the previously seen cowardly weapons were not looking too bad if they were going to win the war. The Germans were the first ones to actually consider using chlorine gas that they had as a byproduct from industry. But aside from the moral standpoint, there was actually a legal problem, because weapons that fired or dispersed toxic substances were banned. In the 1899 Hague Peace Conference, the major powers signed a declaration to, quote, abstain from the use of projectiles, the sole object of which is the diffusion of asphyxiating or deleterious gases. The 1907 Hague Convention repeated this ban. However, if you read this carefully as the Germans did, you would see the word projectiles. And if you think about it a bit, no one mentioned anything about using chemical weapons, only about their delivery method. So, the Germans realized this loophole in the conventions, and instead of firing gas shells, they would disperse the toxic chlorine gas simply by releasing it from cylinders and letting the wind blow it to the enemy lines. This way, they were technically not breaking the rules. On the evening of the 22nd of April 1915, Allied troops along the line in Flanders noticed something drifting toward them. It wasn't a bombardment, and it wasn't the usual smoke from artillery. It moved too slowly, and it carried an odd greenish color as the breeze pushed it forward from the German trenches. At first, some soldiers thought it was just a smokescreen for an infantry assault, but within moments they understood what this was. By that point, it was already too late. What they were watching was chlorine, released from over 5,000 cylinders the Germans had positioned in secret over the previous weeks while they waited for the perfect wind to release it. Once the valves opened, more than 160 tons of gas flowed out along a front roughly 4 miles long. Dense, sickly clouds rolled into trenches and dugouts, where the men inside had no protection because proper gas masks did not exist yet, as no one had expected such attacks. Some recognized the smell of bleach and realized what they were breathing in, but by that point the damage had already begun. We're going to show you the effects of chlorine on the human body in a bit, so you will understand it better. French captain Georges Lamour managed to contact his headquarters and shout that his trenches were overwhelmed before the line went silent. His message ended with him dying at his post. Soldiers stumbled out of their positions with grey skin and bulging eyes, grabbing their throats as they tried to escape the cloud. but most of them went only a short distance from their position before collapsing. In less than 10 minutes, an entire French and Algerian front line was erased as a fighting force. More than 1,000 men were killed outright, over 4,000 severely injured. A 4-mile gap opened in the Allied line, something that had simply never happened before on the Western Front. German infantry moved forward behind the cloud with nothing more than gauze pads soaked in bicarbonate solution tied across their faces as protection that was supposed to keep the gas out. They had been told that the gas would clear the way and that they only had to follow. However, none of them were ready for what they walked into. As they advanced, they passed bodies in positions that made it very clear these men had not died quickly or cleanly. If we described it here, the video would surely be taken down from YouTube, and the Germans seeing it for the first time were just as stunned as anyone else. Because this weapon had never been used on such a scale before, nobody really knew what to expect. A huge gap opened in the Allied front, which looked like the perfect chance for a major breakthrough. But the Germans had not planned their follow-up forces properly, as they did not expect such an effect. And also nobody knew how safe it was to move into the contaminated area. Some of their own men had been caught by the edge of the cloud. So, instead of rushing forward in the first hours, they hesitated. They dug in and lost the chance to turn this shock into a decisive capture of Ypres on that same night. You see, chlorine is heavier than air, so the cloud rolled on, drifting into nearby villages and low-lying ground. It killed many more civilians and animals in villages downwind from German lines. On the Allied side, the commanders were trying to plug a gap in the line. They were shocked not only by the casualties, but by what they saw as a clear violation of the rules that had been agreed on before the war. There were no proper gas masks ready, so reinforcements had to put a piece of fabric soaked in urine over the mouth and nose. It sounds disgusting, and it surely was not pleasant to wear, but the ammonia in the urine could help reduce the chlorine's effect. And seeing what happened to the affected soldiers, men accepted it very quickly. Before we move on to the even worse agents that followed quickly after the Germans broke the ice, let's first explain what chlorine itself did to the human body. When it was released from cylinders along the front, because it was heavier than air, it hugged the ground and slid down into shell holes, trenches, and dugouts. Chlorine is very reactive with water. When it comes into contact with moisture, it reacts and forms hydrochloric acid. Anywhere on your body that is naturally wet becomes a target. The eyes and the inside of the nose and throat become extremely irritated. It is basically as if someone spilled acid on you, but the lungs take the main hit. Inside them, the tiny air sacs where oxygen normally passes into the blood are coated with a thin film of moisture. Chlorine reaches those air sacs, reacts with that moisture and turns it into acid. The tissue becomes inflamed